Hi, everyone. As we mentioned this week, we are going to be doing a couple of Panopto recordings because the MBA students are supposed to be on their international trip. I know very little, but I do know that they were slotted to go to Dubai, but unfortunately, I believe they are heading back here, so I just hope everyone is safe and makes it home safely. And I will continue to provide Panopto recordings like we anticipated the rest of this week. So with that said, let's continue our conversation about how customers make decisions. So just to quickly recap again, we were talking about this 5-stage process in how consumers make decisions. And hopefully, if you're a marketer, they are selecting your brand. And earlier we had talked about some complicated process or ways in which consumers might make effortful decisions, but we realize as consumers ourselves that we oftentimes don't put a lot of effort into our decision making, and instead, oftentimes we make rather quick, simple decisions. And consumers might use a variety of different decision shortcuts. And so that's what we were beginning to talk about in this next form of decision making, that some scholars might even say that 95 or over 90% of our decisions as consumers actually use more of this simplified decision making process. So there are what scholars might refer to as heuristics or rules of thumb that are essentially decision shortcuts, and sometimes they're thought of as if-then statements. So if this, then that. Okay, and so you'll see that rule applied in some of these heuristics that I'll talk about here today. Now, I do want to pause a minute and say there is a really interesting book that I read years ago. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow, I believe is the title. And I just was checking on my Audible account because I listened to it years ago, and it said it was a 20-hour book or 20-plus hour book. And I highly recommend it. So if you are interested in learning either more about how consumers make decisions or how you yourself make decisions, I highly recommend it. It's an interesting read, but again, it's called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. I just checked it out, or checked back on my Audible account, and I believe it was over 20 hours. So if you ever have a long delay in an airport, like some of you might have right now, or you're traveling, I think it's an interesting thing to listen to. So let's talk about some of these heuristics. So we talked a little bit about covariation. And what covariation means is that sometimes consumers infer attributes of products that might be considered hidden based on what they can observe. And so in class, I talked about how if we're going to buy a used car, if we observe that the car looks clean, we might infer that, oh, this was taken care of. Like the owner probably kept up with its oil changes and tire rotations and the typical required maintenance. And so we might infer that it's a decent quality used car based on what we can see its cleanliness. This can be applied in many different product categories. So for instance, some of us might see, oh, it has probiotics. It must be good for us. Or, oh, it has X grams of fiber or X grams of protein. It's healthy. It's a good choice. Now, some of you might see X grams of fiber, probiotics, and think, oh, it tastes terrible. Again, all of us make decisions a little bit differently. But as a marketer, we're trying to understand how are customers making decisions in this product category, what's important to them, and how do we market ourselves that we're the preferred brand of choice. So that's covariation, inferring hidden dimensions based on what we can observe. So if clean, then it's taken care of in this car example. Country of origin is similar in that consumers strongly associate certain items or products with specific countries. So I recently saw an ad for Culver's. If you haven't been to Culver's, they often say from Wisconsin with love. And so they talk about their butter burgers and their cheeseburgers, their dairy products. Wisconsin is the Dairyland state. And so I think Culver's is doing a decent job playing on what people think of when they think of Wisconsin. And so, oh, it must be good because it's from Wisconsin. Kraft Cheese used to do this a lot in terms of their American cheese and their advertising there. Some other countries that consumers might think of for certain products might be things like Switzerland for watches. So, oh, if they see a product or the watch and it's made from Switzerland, they think, oh, it must be of high quality. Or, ooh, leather goods from Italy, made in Italy, must be high quality. France and wine. And so these country of origin inferences can be used for many, many different product categories because we realize that the country of origin is relevant to consumers and when they make decisions in that particular product category. Familiar brand names can serve as a shortcut for higher prices because oftentimes brands that we're aware of we think are of higher quality. And this can come from a variety of different means. One is referred to as what's referred to as the mere exposure effect. Simply that the more that we're exposed to something, the more positive our associations are generally with that stimulus. So that's why I often say to students who are starting their job, especially when they have a choice to go to the office or if they can stay remote, sometimes it's better just to be seen. And so to go to the office, let people see your face, let people see you around and get to know you because the more they're exposed to you, the more they encounter you, generally, oftentimes, the more positive associations they will associate with you. And so the more positive associations they'll have. And there's many different theories behind this, why familiar brand names tend to be perceived as higher quality and perceived as performing better. Consumers tend to have higher trust and believe these products are more reliable or of a better value. And one account is simply an evolutionary psychology account. And it says that if we go back to our great ancestors, you can think about how our great ancestors encountered animals. And so animals that people encountered every day are typically harmless. And so you can think about birds. What else do you encounter every day? Squirrels. You might see a bunny rabbit or two. But those that you encounter less frequently, like a bobcat or a snake or a bear, they're often dangerous. And so familiarity has been like a proxy for safety. The animals we encountered frequently didn't hurt us. And so there's some accounts of how this works with babies is that babies can recognize their mother's voice before they're even born. And so as individuals, this evolutionary psychology account says familiarity tends to communicate safety and otherwise generally good things. And that's why making your brand known and familiar generally can lead to positive results in the marketplace. You'll learn something new there. Higher prices is also another rule of thumb, as we've talked about. It's like covariation. We oftentimes believe as consumers that higher prices signal higher quality. And so we make that inference. So if a high price, then high quality. There are other choice tactics too, like buying local. We generally believe that sometimes if we're buying things that are local, we're doing better for the local economy. We're minimizing the carbon footprint involved in shipping products. And so oftentimes we think, oh, if it's local, then it's better. Normative tactic is looking at what everybody else is doing. If you think back to what I asked last week, what are your other classes doing while this international trip takes place? That's, a normative tactic, trying to figure out what other people are doing, and then that influences your decision. Variety seeking is another one. Sometimes people just want to fulfill boredom and try something new. And so there are certain product categories, oftentimes where you see a lot of innovation or a lot of variability, new products getting launched very frequently. You tend to see variety seeking often as a choice tactic being used. And so for me, I would say it happens a lot with snack foods and protein bars and restaurants. And so these are all different ways in which consumers might try to simplify their decisions. And there are many more heuristics out there. And if you read the Thinking Fast and Slow book, they'll talk about several others and how these heuristics affect our decision making. One last one I have here too is the IKEA effect. And simply that means that we tend to place a disproportionately high value on things we have invested effort in making. And so these could be things like building your own furniture. We tend to like it more because we created it, we did it. And ultimately, altogether, these heuristics allow us to simplify our decision making, but focus on one or very few factors, typically only one factor, that drives our decision to select a particular product. And while we focus on that one factor, we're ignoring many other factors or many other stimuli that we're exposed to in our environment. And so as a marketer, again, it's important to understand how are customers making their decisions. What are they relying on? What is important to them? And so if we know how consumers are making decisions, we know what they're prioritizing, we know what they're paying attention to, we know what they're ignoring, we can better market our products to not only just design products that fit what the consumers are basing their decisions on, but also we need to communicate effectively to our target market, hey, our product has this feature and we perform very well on that feature. Now, consumers do not make perfect decisions. I think that's probably coming across in this lecture as how we use these decision shortcuts. We don't necessarily make the best decision at all times. And so we have a lot of biases our decision-making process. And I am going to skip over some of these because simply I think we're a little behind, but I'll briefly talk about some of them here. So one is we're often reluctant to waste something we have already paid for, and that's the sunk cost fallacy. So if you think about how, let's say you bought tickets to, let's just say, a sporting event, and now the forecast is going to be terrible. It's going to be maybe freezing rain, below freezing temperatures, and it's an outdoor sporting event. If you bought those tickets, you are more likely to go to that event than if you were given those tickets for free. And so that's what's an example of this sunk cost fallacy. You don't want to waste something that you paid for. Now, if you were and you didn't pay anything, maybe you'd pass and stay home and be nice and warm and cozy inside. We as humans also tend to emphasize losses more than gains. Oftentimes we're very risk averse, but there is research out there that says that consumers, how they're affected by risk and the choices they make are a function of how things are framed and positioned. Again, the Thinking Fast and Slow would be a great book for you to read if you're interested in this kind of stuff. I'm skipping over this, but this would just be fun for you to read if you're interested in learning about prospect theory and how risk affects judgments and decisions. There are other biases in our judgment processes. So consumers oftentimes engage in confirmation bias. So this type of bias is when we oftentimes only pay attention to information that adheres to what we already believe. And so, for instance, if we're an advocate of Apple, like we're a heavy user of Apple, we're going to pay attention to information that confirms our beliefs towards Apple and discount or possibly avoid information that talks about how a competitor's products might actually be better. So we tend to overweight confirming information and underweight contrary information that affects our existing judgments. And while I say this, and I'm giving this example in terms of an individual end user like you and I using Apple or Samsung products, this also applies to B2B buyers. So if we think about businesses selling to other businesses, and let's just say we're a buyer for a particular organization, let's just say Auburn University buying software from another company. We're subject to confirmation bias and all of the different biases that I've talked about in this course and all of the different decision-making processes we've talked about. Because at the end of the day, we have humans involved in the buying process and we can be subject to bias. And last week I talked about AI being used for decision-making too. And there is bias involved in AI decisions too, because AI is crafted or built upon human data. You know, the data it's trained on affects how AI executes decisions and output. And so we're going to see bias happen regardless of whether at the end of the day a human is making a decision or an AI tool. And again, these biases occur in all different contexts, both by end users and in the business to business world. So in the business to business world, as I was talking about with confirmation bias, an example of that would be simply that if a buyer has a preferred vendor, that their ability to focus on information that runs contrary to their belief that their preferred vendor is the best choice, it's going to be hard for them to consider that information because they're likely focusing on the information that aligns with their judgment that their preferred vendor is the best choice. Self-positivity bias is simply the bias that exists when consumers make judgments about the extent to which they're vulnerable to essentially having bad things happen to them. In other words, we have inflated self-views. We tend to think that things can't happen to us. They might happen to other people, but they're not going to happen to us. And so examples of this could be things about like texting and driving. Oh, you know, as much as this information is shared about how texting while driving can slow your reaction time or increase your risk of a car accident, self-positivity bias might operate and say, oh, I'm smart and I have got a good reaction time. I can text and drive. It won't happen to me, but it can happen to other people. This oftentimes happens with like AIDS, smoking, drinking and driving, many different activities is where this self-positivity bias might occur. And that's why oftentimes testimonials and advertisements are very effective to show that, like others, when we're thinking about an advertisement, people that are like the end user, if we have them appear in the advertisement and we show that, hey, this can happen to them, it hopefully gets across the feeling like, hey, it could happen to you as the end consumer. And these types of ads can be very effective at combating some of those issues that I talked about. Negativity bias is another bias. This is how we tend to make mood congruent judgments. So negativity bias is the fact that we tend to give more weight to negative information than positive information when forming judgments. So we, for example, might overweight negative reviews that we see online. And so what this means for as the marketer is that we need to manage negative information that is shared about our brands, especially in the day of social media where information spreads like wildfire. Like, we have got to manage any sort of negative shared content because we know that consumers weight that information more heavily in their judgments. And again, mood often serves as an initial anchor. So we tend to think more positively about things when we are in a positive mood. Some evidence suggests that when we're in a positive mood, we tend to reduce our search for alternative courses of action. We also attend less to negative information. Some argue that this is a mood maintenance strategy so that when people are in a positive mood, they want to maintain their positive mood. And so they tend to ignore negative information. And what this means for marketers is essentially that we should put people in good moods. Okay, if we want them to like our products and choose our products, we should put people in good moods through the store environment and through our commercials too, because if we're having a mood congruent effect, that hopefully means that they will like our products as well. Ultimately, marketers can't control any of these biases that I talked about in consumer judgment, but marketers, again, can aim to understand how people are making decisions and what sort of mental shortcuts consumers might be using so that they can associate their brand with the mental shortcut that is in place. Move on to information that happens, or issues, I should say, that happen at the purchase stage. So we're talking about these 5 stages in this decision-making process. And so we're talking about how consumers make decisions at the purchase stage. And also let's talk about some other issues that happen that marketers should consider. One is ultimately marketers should aim to reduce risk. If you think about risk as being friction, right, that might put a consumer on hold, we want to remove that friction. We want to remove that sort of uncertainty. And so here we see marketers might offer warranties or have really good return policies or flexible return policies, I should say. And also very informative and educated salespeople that can handle any customer objections or also educate customers on the benefits of the products or any other hurdles that consumers might need to overcome. Salespeople who are trained well should be able to overcome those objections and show how their product can meet the customer's need. We got to make purchases easy for customers. Marketers can do this either through like a one-click system, and we see this, we've talked about subscription models already, those sort of auto-renew policies or programs that some companies have in place. Anything that makes it easy for the customer is likely going to be better for the company than anything that makes the process more effortful. And so the online design is critical. So if we think about online storefronts, we got to think about great imagery if we're talking about human buyers. Again, if we're talking about AI buyers, then we need to have structured data and some good information. We want to have people add products to their cart without leaving a page. It's the most annoying thing if you're shopping and then you put something in your cart and you get prompted to check out. You're going to have a lower average transaction dollar amount if your page is structured in that way. You want to be able to have customers add products to their cart and stay on that page so they can add more easily. Showing how products can be coordinated with each other, mixing and matching, showing complementary products, all of that can build the sale. And also having a one-page checkout. Make it easy. It's like that one-click ordering I had talked about. And ultimately, all of this comes down to those issues of utility we talked about in the very first chapter. Having products available, having the inventory for people to buy, making it easy for them to buy so they know where to buy it, they know how to buy it, and it's easy for them to take possession of the product. So again, whether that's flexible financing, installation, home delivery, whatever it may be, payment plans, making it easy for them to acquire gets at that last possession utility we talked about. So after customers make a purchase, then what? It doesn't end for marketers. It continues. So as a marketer, we want to understand, are they happy? Do customers feel like they made the right choice? Are they satisfied with our product or service? That is a critical issue, along with, are they sharing positive information with other potential buyers? So let's talk a little bit about satisfaction versus dissatisfaction versus delight. They're technically different concepts. So if we think about satisfaction as customers' expectations being met, dissatisfaction is when customers' expectations are disconfirmed. They're not met. In other words, performance is below the expectation level. That's dissatisfaction. Satisfaction is when performance is at the expectation level. And technically, scholars tend to think that delight is when performance exceeds expectations. So it's disconfirmation, but in a positive way. That performance didn't fall short. No, it exceeded expectations. That's what delight is considered. Now, we tend to see that the higher the level of involvement, so you can think of involvement as the personal relevance in the decision being made. So what is the customer's degree of personal relevance in this decision? And generally, that means that the more relevance, the higher personal relevance, the higher the effort and time put forth in the decision-making process. And what we tend to see is that there's this higher level of involvement tends to make dissatisfaction more painful. And it tends to be more painful when there's a higher dollar value or higher opportunity costs, and it's also more emotionally involving. So you want to think about, I think a great example of this is thinking about a wedding. That's usually a very important decision for a couple. And planning that wedding oftentimes is a very high involvement decision, right? Deciding if there's going to be a venue, where it's taking place, what, kind of catering needs need to be met. And so imagine if you were buying beer for a wedding and you get there, you show up to your wedding, and the vendor supplied the wrong beer. How do you feel? If it's you buying beer for your own personal consumption and you actually grab the wrong case, or maybe the cashier put the wrong case in your basket, or whatever it may be, your feeling of dissatisfaction then is likely not so bad compared to if it was your wedding, okay? And so marketers need to manage dissatisfaction. That's why we need to measure satisfaction and address any shortcomings that are especially considered these sort of high involvement decisions. Now, I do want to mention one interesting thing about how marketers might engage in service recovery. So a service failure is when there's a dissatisfying event. So something went wrong. The marketer is essentially to blame. These happen all the time. It's ubiquitous, right? You get to a hotel room, maybe your air conditioning's broken. You rent a vehicle and maybe something's wrong with it. Service failures happen all the time. You probably ordered something from a restaurant and when it was brought to your table, something was wrong, right? These things happen all the time. And marketers should have recovery strategies in place on how to handle them. And so that's referred to as service recovery when you look at how you're going to address the service failure. And there's a really interesting concept, and it's called the service recovery paradox. And what this means that depending on how the marketer overcomes the service failure, if service recovery is done well, it can actually make a customer more satisfied and possibly more loyal than had no failure ever occurred. And so I'm going to take an example, let's just say here, with the Hound, because I love the Hound. It's a great place for burgers here in Auburn, Alabama. And let's say that I'm at the Hound and I order a burger and I say I want it well done. They bring it out to my table and it's raw. I bite into it. I see it's very juicy. It's not what I ordered. I ask, what flag or wave to the waiter. The waiter comes over. I explain, hey, this is a very rare burger. I ordered medium well. What if the server were to say, oh, I am so sorry. Dinner's on us tonight, and I also will make sure that you have a complimentary dessert as well. How do you think I feel about that? I might feel, yeah, it stinks that, I didn't get what I wanted the first time, but now I'm getting my whole meal, or let's just say my whole table, paid for, and I don't have to fork out a single penny. I might be thrilled, and I might be even more satisfied with that experience and that recovery than had I just gone there, ordered my medium well burger, my burger got delivered or brought to the table, everything was fine, we went on with our evening, right? Like, if everything went smoothly, perhaps my satisfaction's at an 8 or a 9, but the fact that this bad situation happened and the server recovered and now I'm not paying anything, I might have satisfaction at a 10 now. Service recovery is very critical. It is an opportunity for a marketer or a frontline employee to fix the situation and really change that customer's perspective on the company. It's a great opportunity for the company to show, hey, we really care about our customers. We want to make it right. Okay. And so service recovery strategies should be a part of a marketer's operating guidelines. Now, lastly, one other thing I want to mention about the post-purchase evaluation, and we're going to talk about how marketers measure satisfaction later in this course. And so beyond measuring customer satisfaction and likelihood of repurchasing again, there are many other ways of, or other engagement metrics, I should say, that marketers might pay attention to at this post-purchase stage. One other thing I want to mention, though, too, is that it's really interesting. I would say the last 5 or so years, we've seen that social scoring has also been a really key metric assessed post-purchase. So if you think about if you've ever been in Uber or you stayed at an Airbnb, you can rate your driver. You as a customer can rate your host. And at the same time, on some of these platforms, the service provider can also rate you as the customer. And so it's really interesting to see that these social scoring activities operate both ways, and extent it gives marketers a little bit more power in that you can potentially ban people from patronizing your service in the future. For example, with OpenTable, if you have missed too many reservations, I believe OpenTable can ban that particular customer from making reservations in the future. And so social scoring, I think, is a great opportunity for not only customers to have some power, and at the same time, it also allows the marketer to have a little bit of power too. Now, I'm going to just kind of gloss over this. There are many factors that influence our purchase process. I already gave the example of how we might evaluate products differently based on whether the product's merchandised on carpet versus tile. And so there's a lot of factors that affect our state leading into the purchase environment. In other words, there are contextual, personal, and situational factors that affect us that will ultimately drive how we make decisions when we're in the store. And while we're in the store, there are many different ways in which the atmosphere and the merchandising and other people in the store can ultimately affect our decision-making process. I'm not going to test you on anything on this slide, but I do want you to know that there are both personal factors and situational factors that affect how customers make decisions. And so a lot of detail goes into making sure the purchase environment is favorable for customers. And I know I talked about, sorry, let me shut my phone off. I know I had talked about salespeople already and how they're hopefully very informative and well trained and hopefully provide a favorable experience to the customer. But it's not just salespeople that influence customer decisions. It's also the people in the environment as well. And I think there's a great clip if you've ever seen the movie Pretty Woman and Julia Roberts goes shopping and the salespeople judge her based on what Julia Roberts is wearing and they don't want to service her. And people make judgments of other people like that all the time based on what they're wearing, what they're driving, what kind of brand of purse they have. It's human nature. People make those judgments. And oftentimes they're faulty. Okay. And so if you're a salesperson, I would say don't do what they did in Pretty Women. But at the same time, as a marketer, we have to realize that when our customers shop, they are affected by the number of people in store and who's in the store there with them. And so oftentimes marketers may want to set certain dress codes to make sure that shopping environment or the purchase environment is consistent and favorable for the customer. And I think a great example of this is when you think about country clubs. Oftentimes you see that country clubs or golf courses set dress codes and that other customers are wearing similar things. And so it provides that sort of consistent experience for the consumer. Some restaurants have dress codes. I know there's some events here at Auburn where there's certain dress codes. And even thinking back to the COVID days is when customers were supplying masks to other consumers in the stores. If you were like me, there were certain stores in Auburn that I did not want to frequent because when the pandemic first started and everybody was wearing masks, there were some stores where people weren't wearing masks. And it made me feel really uncomfortable being in those stores since we knew very little about the virus at that time. And so because other customers weren't wearing them and I observed that, I just wanted to get out and I didn't want to shop there anymore. And I became a huge fan of Publix at that time because I felt like it was a consistent experience and also a very safe environment for me because not only were they supplying masks and the customers wearing masks there, Publix also, had an employee wiping down the carts at the front entrance. Every time you went in there, you would see an employee wiping things down and making sure things were clean. Here's a little video if you want to watch. It's about some retailer tricks in terms of the store design and how they try to influence the customer's state to affect their purchase decisions. Now, we've talked a lot about consumers making decisions, and while I talk about this 5-stage process of consumer decision making, again, I want to reiterate that it applies to business markets too, because at the end of the day, we are talking about consumers, or humans, I should say. We are talking about humans making decisions. And so we are going to be subject to these different biases, to these different decision shortcuts, or maybe we're using a compensatory or non-compensatory strategy. we are subject to all of these issues regardless of what we're buying for or who we're buying for, whether it's for us, for a friend, or for a business. We can all have these different biases or processes in place. So let's talk a little bit about business markets. So there are different types of business markets. So here again, we're thinking about businesses selling to other businesses. So we're thinking about businesses buying for their business, okay? And they could be buying for products or services used in daily operations like office supplies or toilet paper or computers, but we also could be talking about raw materials too, such as buying a product that is to be used for a finished good. Ultimately, if you are selling to businesses that operate in the business market, you again need to understand your customers just like you need to understand end users. You need to figure out how are they making decisions, what is important to them, and also the context. Do they have certain restraints or certain certain processes in place or policies in place that affect their decision making? And so we'll talk about some of these issues in this course. And so ultimately, when we're talking about business markets, we're talking about commercial markets, we're talking about reseller markets, we're talking about government markets, and we're talking about institutional markets as well. Make business markets a little unique. Well, that's what's bulleted on this slide. One is when we're talking about business markets, oftentimes they have what's referred to as a buying center. Don't necessarily think of that as being a physical space. No. What I'm talking about is that oftentimes when it comes to buying at the business level, we have multiple people involved in making that purchase decision. It might be users, it might be engineers, it might be some finance folks or accounting folks, maybe some marketers, but ultimately there's going to be a number of people involved in the decision at some institutions or at some in some business markets. And so it's important to understand who's involved in the buying process, what are their roles, and knowing, what's important to them. And I'll give you an example. Here at Auburn, we were going to hire a firm for some Salesforce training. I was involved, the faculty involved who teach the particular sales course were involved. We had IT involved and an associate dean involved. We had multiple people involved in this vendor selection process. In business markets, we also look at hard and soft costs. So the hard costs are obviously the monetary costs. So what are the purchase costs, the shipping, the installation? All of that goes into the total price paid. We're going to care about that. But oftentimes we also care about soft costs too. In business markets, you oftentimes see firms care about downtime or opportunity costs or HR costs that are associated with the particular purchase. And so a lot more care or consideration might be around soft costs too. We often see reciprocity be a big deal in business markets in that you typically see buyers and sellers buy from each other. So here at the university, we see sometimes firms that donate to us, perhaps we use them in catering, okay? And so we reciprocate. They help us out, we help them out. And so reciprocity, this kind of, mutual give and take, how can we benefit each other? You do this for me, I do this for you, oftentimes is a norm that guides the relationships in when we're talking about B2B relationships. We also see mutual dependence be a big deal in that oftentimes a client relationship can represent a significant portion of that firm's business. And I think this is what Mike Sutter was starting to talk about in that for Bonnie Plants, Lowe's and Home Depot were huge clients for them, right? If they are huge customers, if Bonnie Plants were to lose Home Depot or Lowe's as a customer, how much of their business, how much of Bonnie Plants' business would still be around? I don't know. That's Mike has that information, not me. But if you think about in the B2B world, in this case, Bonnie Plants is dependent on Lowe's and Home Depot, and Lowe's and Home Depot is often dependent on Bonnie Plants because, as Mike talked about, Bonnie Plants is the key supplier. So, again, that sort of mutual dependence can guide decision making, and hopefully, if you have mutually beneficial relationships, that sort of joint making process. How can we do this together? How can we both achieve our goals and do this successfully? Those conversations, that sort of climate, can be very favorable to building those long-term mutually beneficial relationships. And ultimately, when we talk about the B2B world, we tend to see that in business markets, mostly companies care about the outcomes over the experience. Okay? At the end of the day, is the purchase adding value? Is there an ROI on the acquisition or on the purchase? Businesses are going to be very performance focused. Is it doing what we intended it to do? Yes, emotions are still relevant in B2B decision making, like as we talked about. But they're probably not as relevant when we talk about customers and how we feel after the purchase, right? We're very emotional if we talk about end users. In the B2B world, we're going to be caring more about that ROI and the overall product or service that was purchased. The business buying process is a little bit different. This is a common process, what I have illustrated on this slide. Again, businesses are unique. It is the marketer's job to understand the buyer, in this case the business, and understand the buyer's process and the particular processes or policies that they have in place. Okay. So some buying decisions I will say are very routine. Others are not. Okay, like if I think about buying paper, right? You just hit reorder if you're buying computer paper for your business. But some are going to be unique, such as buying a new sort of machinery or software. And that will take a lot more effort. When we talk about the more effortful buying decision, again, these are some common stages that a buying firm might go through. And so one is that there's problem recognition. There's a difference between their current state and their desired state. Very similar to what we talked about before with consumer decision making. Then typically you're developing your specifications. What is it that you need? And oftentimes this is very, very critical because if you're buying new equipment, new software, you have to make sure that the purchase is integrated with your current technologies and your software, or your operating process, I should say. So you develop, special specifications that fit your needs. And so, for instance, when we were hiring a Salesforce consultant or a Salesforce firm, we were looking at, okay, we want somebody to be able to do this for 2 weeks. They need to be able to do these sorts of trainings, have expertise in these certain areas, need to be able to work with students, which is a big deal if you've never worked with students before. And so we had certain specifications in place that we were looking for in particular vendors. And they needed to obviously be able to teach and have that sort of training experience. So after a firm set up specifications, they then identify vendors or potential companies who will meet their needs and qualify them. Are they somebody that can meet the buyer's needs in the specified time frame? Oftentimes, buying firms will have an approved vendor list. And so that helps narrow down the vendors that are identified as possibly providing a solution. And so sometimes you can't just go out and search the open marketplace depending on a given firm's buying process. You have to be sometimes they have to use an approved vendor. Then usually from the vendors they've identified, firms will seek proposals or bids. So essentially they're getting estimates. So for instance, like the YMCA oftentimes is required to solicit 3 bids, even for something as simple as like a small paint job. Here at Auburn, we have an approved vendor list, and I believe you oftentimes need to get 3 bids as well. And so getting to be an approved vendor is very important for firms, and making that initial cut, very, very important. So firms will oftentimes, seek these certain bids or proposals and then ultimately select a vendor. And sometimes the decision criteria, again, will be unique to the customer. Sometimes, if you're working for the government, they oftentimes go with the lowest bid. So what vendor provided the lowest cost, that's what you might be forced to go with if you are the business buyer. But at some firms, price isn't necessarily the driving factor. And typically, when you're talking about, like here I gave the example here at Auburn, you tend to have to go with the lowest price. If we're talking about a non-government sending or a non-government market, so some of these other markets, maybe price isn't as important because it often isn't. Firms might might care more about what sort of service guarantees are going to be offered. If we have something go wrong, can they have a rep come and fix it right away? Is there a quick turnaround? How quickly can they get us the product? What is the firm's reputation? What is their quality? What do their other customers have to say about them? And do we have any personal ties? So sometimes those personal relationships they have with the selling organization will matter more. And so vendor selection isn't always just what's the lowest price. There are some other quality or other reputation or existing factors that will have an impact on vendor selection. Then order processing takes place. So here, this is like processing the order. So are there credit terms? Are there, delivery dates that need to be set? What sort of technical assistance needs to occur? What sort of training needs to occur? So all of those elements tend to be addressed at this order processing stage. And then after the purchase, there tends to be a vendor performance review. So organizations might review their approved vendor list, adapt it, modify it, add to it, or eliminate some. And so it's a lot more, I would say, effortful and stage-like than individual buying decisions that you and I often make. So now let's talk a little bit about market segmentation and target markets. So again, to talk a little bit about what these concepts mean, again, market segmentation is all about dividing up the market into relatively homogeneous segments or homogeneous groups, so that within a group, customers have similar likes, needs, tastes, and wants or preferences, but across groups, there's differences. Okay, so depending on what segment you're in, it's going to determine what your likes, your tastes, your needs, your wants, or preferences are. Okay, so if everybody was all the same, there would be no need to segment the market, right? You could have one marketing plan geared towards all people. And that is what mass marketing essentially does, is that here we don't engage in segmentation. A firm that engages in mass marketing has one marketing program. So think of their pricing of products similarly, similar distribution, similar promotion for a product or a brand. Oftentimes is the case with commodities like oil or agricultural products. But oftentimes we see these other approaches being used because we realize that customers are oftentimes different, okay? And so we might market to different segments differently. And so that's what a multi-segment approach is that we seek to attract buyers in more than one segment. And so we're targeting different segments with different marketing programs. Now, of course, the costs of doing this are going to be higher, right? Because now we're looking at different product lines or different brands, different price points, different marketing materials. But ultimately, what this means is that, okay, with having these different marketing programs, being more targeted at a particular segment, the ROI should be better because we're going to be more relevant to that particular customer, and that customer will be more likely to buy it. I'll give you an example. If you think about Estee Lauder, okay, Estee Lauder is a cosmetic company, but they own many different brands. Okay, you might be surprised to learn that Estee Lauder not only owns the Estee Lauder brand, but they also own Clinique and MAC and Aveda and Origins, these other different lines of cosmetics. And if you think about these other brands, and if I were in class, I'd be pulling up the websites or showing you the different models they use, you can see that they're very different product lines. So I would argue that Estee Lauder is generally for older women, whereas Clinique is a brand that's geared more towards younger women. MAC, I would say, is a brand that's geared towards kind of like the college student age, kind of some hipster people who are daring and bold and willing to maybe wear some brighter colors. Whereas Aveda and Origins tend to be more aromatherapy based or eco-conscious consumers who want more natural ingredients. And so that's a very different customer, so to say, than a MAC user. And so Estee Lauder has these different brands and ultimately different products with the goal of reaching different segments or different groups of customers. Many firms have this multi-segment approach. And so you can probably be thinking of different larger brands out there that have multiple, basically own multiple other brands targeted towards different customers. Now, a market segment or a market concentration approach, this approach focuses on a single market segment. And so you might have one product or multiple products targeted towards one segment with the goal of getting the maximum amount of customers in the segment. And I think a great example of this is Porsche, right? Porsche focuses on having fancy cars to people who like cars, right? They're a higher price point. They're known for being manufactured very well. And so it's kind of in its own unique category in that Porsche is trying to get the maximum amount of market share in that sport, like kind of sports car category. And so with this market concentration approach, you are essentially getting operating economies through production and distribution. And so if you think about all of the different products that Porsche offers, they're really all towards the same segment, and their advertising to some extent can benefit all of their different models of vehicles that they make. Niche marketing, and some call it niche marketing, and actually both ways of pronouncing that word are correct. But what that means is here with niche marketing, you're focusing on a very small, well-defined market segment. And despite the size of the market, okay, again, it's going to be very, very small, a firm should be profitable because of its high share of the market. So I think a great example of this deals with scent machines that hook up to your HVAC system, right? That is a very specialized product. It's a very small market of people who are willing to buy such a machine that actually will pump scent into people's homes. And so there are a few firms that operate in that industry, like Aroma 360, and they try to tap a very large portion of the market and do well because of their ability to have significant market share in a very small space or a small market. Now, I think earlier in this class, we had talked about one of the students posted on the discussion board how technology has really changed how they are able to customize the marketing program for customers and make it more specialized. That's exactly where I'm going with on this second column over here, is that with advances in technology, marketers have been able to provide a more tailored offering to customers and have more of a customized program, again, for each individual customer. And this is especially true for digital products that you can buy online that aren't tangible, like you can't necessarily touch them. So some examples of this deal with one-to-one marketing. And so that is essentially where you are providing a unique product or marketing program for each individual customer in the targeted segment. And this is very common in business markets where you're customizing software, you're customizing machinery. And in consumer markets, we oftentimes see this with luxury goods, right? They're custom made for the wealthy and non-wealthy too, I should say. So whoever's willing to spend money on that particular offering. Mass customization is a little different in that we are offering unique products or solutions to customers, but typically there is a basic product that gets adapted or tweaked to the customer's needs. And so here you can think like perhaps there's a baseline shoe or a baseline shirt, and then it gets adapted to the colors or the patterns or whatever the customer picks out. The same practice occurs with computers, right? There are some basic features, but then a customer can choose different or adapt or modify other features to make it personalized to them. Okay, so that is mass customization. Think there is some baseline product that essentially gets adapted or tweaked to fit the customer's needs. Permission-based marketing is also central to oftentimes these more segmented or individualized approaches. In that permission-based marketing means that we have customers choose to be a part of the firm's segment. So like opting into a mailing list or an email list, and so opting to accept cookies, things of that sort, because by getting the customer to agree to these things, the company then is getting that additional information and being able to tweak their marketing program. It also eliminates a lot of wasteful marketing expenses because your customers have essentially identified that they fit your target market. Not always, but in most cases. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different bases for segmentation. So these are, again, our different segmentation approaches. And so there are different variables that might be used to divide up the market and then profile the market based on who is in the particular market. Ultimately, the success of a segmentation strategy will depend on the firm's ability to identify how different the needs and wants are of buyers. So again, understanding what's important to them. How are these decisions made? What features matter? Okay. And this information is oftentimes gathered through consumer research, like we talked about those different research techniques we used, and also through the situation analysis. That again, those are the stages in which you can figure out how are customers making decisions and what's important to them. And then ultimately, a marketer will pick a variable or variables that differentiate consumers' needs for the products. So sometimes, in other words, needs are related to the variables listed on this slide. Ultimately, if we were to understand, different needs, and we could place people into different categories or segments based on differences of needs, and then we profile them so that we could say this customer or this segment constitutes people who are looking for this particular benefit, this sort of usage, and they're, X% male, female, this price point, et cetera, et cetera. If you think back to the example with Gordon, he talked about those differences in benefits sought based on cat owners. Okay, so here are different ways you might segment. Again, I would say behavioral segmentation by benefits or needs sought. That's going to be the predominant one. Sometimes, though, you use these others as proxies because these different variables might essentially affect the needs customers are seeking. So, for example, let's take the cell phone market. Let's say that you have a 90-year-old. What do they need a cell phone for? Probably to make phone calls, maybe the internet, but their needs are going to be very different than people who are in their 20s and very different from people who are in their 40s, etc. And so age might be a proxy for benefits sought because they're correlated. Okay? So essentially, firms are going to select variables to divide up the market and tailor their offerings to the customers in a given segment. There are a variety of different research firms out there that are useful or how do I say this? There are a variety of different marketing research firms out there that help companies understand the different segments of customers in the marketplace. So this is one particular tool that is sometimes used. It's called the VALS survey. You can possibly take the survey online and help understand which group you are in. And the VALS survey provides a lot of information to marketers. Now, they offer some free information online, but a paid model gives the marketer much more detailed information on consumers in each of these segments. But what the VALS survey does is it essentially breaks customers into 8 different segments based on their level of resources. Okay, so low levels of resources, you're going to be down over in here. High level of resources is going to be up here. And resources doesn't necessarily equate to only salary. Resources is going to include things like education level and how much schooling you've had. And also age, I should say too. Now, primary motivation, which is the column, so you have ideals, achievement, self-expression. These are essentially what shapes or explains consumers' attitudes and their values. So people who are in the ideal stage or the ideal categories here are caring a lot about knowledge and principles. Okay, these folks here are going to care a lot about achievement products and demonstrate success to their peers. Self-expression are folks who are really into experiences. They desire physical activity, variety, and risk. And so the difference, for instance, between this level and this level is while they have similar, I would say in each column they have similar motivations, they're differentiated by their level of resources. Okay, and so again, that resources deals with age, income, education, and other psychological traits that are linked to resources, like self-confidence. So that would differentiate someone from being an experiencer, for example, compared to a maker. This is an example of the free version of the VAL survey. So in this case, innovators. I thought many of you might actually identify with the innovator category. Can't talk for a minute there. So the innovators are high resources and oftentimes exhibit all three motivations to varying degrees. So they're both, following the ideals. So they care about knowledge and principles. They care about success, but then they also care about experiences too. Okay. So an innovator's a combination of the three, but high resources. And this over here is detail about those belonging in the innovator category. So taking up new information, willing to experiment, skeptical about advertising, care about the future, self-directed, have a variety of interests and activities. I'm just naming a few. If we had the paid version, you would get a lot more detail on this particular segment. Here's another example. This is the achievers. Again, I thought many of you might be identifying with this particular motivation. So me first, my family first. So that sort of individualism we talked about earlier in this class. Being goal-oriented, hardworking, professional. Okay, and so again, this is the free version. Marketers could buy more information on customers in these segments and help them with their marketing efforts to this particular segment. There's other geodemographic segmentation techniques. So what geodemographic segmentation means is that essentially if we go back to this category here, I should explain this better. So behavioral segmentation is segmentation based on behavior. So we're dividing up the marketplace into customer segments based on some behavioral data. Okay, so it could be benefits sought, product uses, or how they use the product, when they use it. Demographic segmentation deals with dividing up the market based on demographics, and so that of these variables here. Psychographic segmentation means you're dividing up the market based on more subjective personality, lifestyles, or motives. Okay, so again, more subjective, less subjective. And so dividing up the market into different segments based on these issues. Geographic segmentation is dividing up the market based on geographic metrics. So oftentimes it's going to be based on zip code is what we see. Now, what geodemographic techniques do is they combine data. Oftentimes you're combining here geographic information and demographic information, hence geodemographic terminology. But what we see here is that we're combining data oftentimes on consumer expenditures and socioeconomic data with geographic information. And so we're understanding how people in certain zip codes or different geographic regions spend money. Okay. And there's many different marketing research firms that engage in helping firms with their geodemographic segmentation. If you click on some of these links, you should be able to play around with it and enter a particular zip code and get more information on that particular segment. And if this works, I'll try it. If not, we can do this in class. So if we click on zip code lookup and we type in 36830, we can see that living in the Auburn area, that they mentioned 5 different segments that are living here. Again, this is the free version. If we had a paid version, marketers would get way more information. So let's pick one of them. So I'm going to pick 11, fast track families, wealthy, middle-aged, mostly with kids. So I click that and, oh, they don't even, oh wait, here we go. Okay. It gives us some information about this segment. So it talks about the number of households. The median household income is $131,705. Their technology, their age ranges, home ownership. And then here, if we go down to lifestyle and media traits, they drive a Ram, they eat at sports bars, they shop at Cabela's, they enjoy hunting, they enjoy planning a ski vacation, they might watch the Cartoon Network or listen to mainstream rock. I actually know some people, I think this, some of my friends align heavily with some of these lifestyle and media traits. And so if you subscribed, you could get a lot more information if you were to click on neighborhood demographics, household demographics, lifestyle, and media. But as you can see, there are firms that have a wealth of information on customers, and marketers could use this so then they know, oh, I should send that particular flyer to residents in that zip code or advertise in that location, and ultimately develop their marketing program based on where they see their customers living. Okay, hopefully that worked. And then Tapestry is similar too. So you can play around with those links that I provided purely for you to have some fun and to explore different tools that are out there. Now, this slide here, going back, talks about segmentation for consumer markets. In the B2B world, we see that segmentation also happens, but we tend to look at segmenting based on different variables. So we might segment based on the demographics, which would be things like what industry potential companies or customers operate in, how big are their firm, or how big is their firm, what size of company is it, what region, where are they located, and also I would say in the B2B world, certain regions, just like how we talked about with customer decision making, how certain regions are associated with different types of products, like leather goods in Italy, certain regions are affiliated with certain types of businesses. So if I were to say, where's the automotive industry in the United States, you might have a certain city pop up in your head. Or if I were to say, where are tech firms mostly located? You know, certain areas would pop in your mind, be very different than vehicles. So ultimately, understanding the regions of different businesses is important. And then also dividing up the marketplace based on operating variables. So what technologies should we focus on? Or what technologies do our customers use? Do we want to service light, heavy, or medium users? Do we want to serve customers that need many or few services? So what sort of need level is relevant? We also should understand their purchasing process. Just like how I talked about, these purchasing processes that businesses use is very individualized to the focal firm. And so understanding their purchasing style, their existing relationships, their policies and criteria. We might want to divide up customers based on that and only focus on certain types of customers who follow a certain purchasing practice. Situational issues, so how quickly they need the products, what level of urgency, what type of order size. And lastly, personal characteristics. Do we care about shared values and loyalty? I think a lot of firms who focus on branding themselves as environmentally friendly are going to focus on vendors and suppliers that share that same value. Okay, I think that's a good example there. So ultimately, in segmenting business markets, different variables are used because, again, remember, think about how those business markets are a little bit unique compared to consumer markets. Ultimately, segmentation in an idealized world, most researchers advocate need-based segmentation. In other words, step number one is figuring out what your customer needs are and dividing customer needs based on benefits sought. Then you identify your segments. So for each need-based segment, you profile that segment. So what are the demographics? What are the lifestyles? What are the usage behaviors that make that segment distinct, identifiable, and actionable? You then look at the attractiveness of the segments. So you're looking at things such as what is the market growth rate of that particular segment, the competitive intensity, the market access. Like, are there big players that make entering that market not possible? You're segmenting the markets, or understanding that particular segments' attractiveness, and then ultimately their profitability. So if you can ultimately identify how profitable your firm would be at targeting the particular segment, that's going to drive decision making in terms of which segments your firm targets. Then you develop a positioning statement for each segment that you plan to target. So what's your value proposition for that particular segment? And then you might conduct an asset test. Again, going back to value proposition, think of benefits minus costs. What are you going to be providing to that particular segment? Then you have the acid test, which is things like a storyboard to see how your market responds. Think back to when we talked about concept testing and the consumer behavior research techniques we talked about. You're looking at our customers envisioning, like if we gave them a sample product and a price and a promotional strategy or a tagline, do they like it? What are their reactions? And see if customers are responding in the way that you intended for them to respond. And then ultimately, after you've conducted perhaps some test marketing and your customer research, you go and launch your full-blown strategy. So you expand the positioning strategy to include the entire marketing mix. And so you're really refining from the acid test and then launching your marketing program. Okay, this is not in your book, but this is like best practices, if I were to say it that way, is that you understand the need, you're dividing up based on the need, you're looking at how attractive and profitable these segments are, you tailor your program to a segment or several segments, you research, you test, you refine, and then you launch. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So ultimately, effective target marketing comes to identifying and profiling distinct groups of buyers that differ. Again, if they didn't differ, there's no need to have segmentation and target markets in the first place. You then choose a market to enter, and then you design your 4Ps to deliver the right benefits to the right customers. Okay. I will post this video and get you another video later this week, and I hope you have a fabulous day.